Hello, it's me. Sorry about the terrible winter lighting. Today we're going to be talking about Small Gods by Terry Pratchett. This, chronologically, in terms of the Discworld universe, and when it was written, is the 13th book. But there are many multi book series and stories within the Discworld universe, so there are a lot of different places to jump in. This one is widely regarded as a really good place to jump in because it makes reference to a lot of other things on the disc, but is itself a standalone. I'm going to be doing plot review, stuff I liked, stuff I didn't like. It'll all be marked on the time bar, whatever needs marking, so feel free to click around. In this book, we follow an acolyte of the Omnian religion called Brother, who lives in a city where the Quisition, the authoritarian religious institution, do a lot of torturing and executing the sin out of people, conquering the surrounding lands, toppling statues, bringing heathen gods to heel. He's gardening one day in his monastery, and a tortoise falls out of the sky, smacks him on the head, and then starts talking to him, telling him that he is the god who the Quisition worship, trapped in the form of a tortoise. Gods in this world have a hierarchy, with their size, power, status, and existence determined by the amount of faith they get from their followers, with the deserts and howling wastes of the disc itself being filled with tiny, mote-sized, brain-dead, forgotten gods. Is trapped in the body of a tortoise despite being quite a well-known god, one of the most widely worshipped gods, and is desperate for Brother to keep believing in him so that he can go on existing. Tagging along with Brother when Brother is sent by the religious Inquisition to another city in a neighboring multi-god nation to take their god, their belief, and stamp out the infidel non-believers. Disclaimer, I am not a religious person. This is a classic case of Terry Pratchett talking about something very serious through a very funny lens, and making you think about things without realizing that you're thinking about things. It is genuinely funny, like all of his stuff, and I maintain that funny is one of the hardest things to write without seeming snarky or uppity. It's one of his strongest suits as a writer, for sure. I think it would be very easy to read this book as a direct critique, a direct attack on belief in a higher power. But I think this is one of Pratchett's more satirical ones. This is a direct attack on oppression and a critique of religious institution, indoctrination, intolerance, hypocrisy. This book is about power being misused, about religion being twisted into a means of control, a means of oppression, a means of class segregation, rather than what it should be, which is a guide to living well, something comforting, something to remind you to be kind. It's about people abusing authority for personal gain and using the rigid structure of organized religion to gain that authority, with the added bonus of misinterpreted scripture, allowing that person to tell everybody else that what they're doing is definitely in their best interests. I think while it critiques aspects of religion, one thing it's actually very defensive of is having a personal relationship with God. And one thing I think was interesting in here was Terry Pratchett exploring the difference between being religious and having faith, because they're not exactly the same. It talks about how religion is actually quite an important aspect of culture and history, and its variety, rather than causing rifts, causing alienation, can actually lend to something very beautiful. It very much paints societies in which many gods from different religious pantheons are worshipped as being more enlightened, more kind places. One thing this book does heavily criticize is the danger of being 100% sure of anything, refusing to accept more information into your worldview, refusing to alter your mindset, and that's something that goes hand in hand with religious extremism. And this is something that Terry Pratchett very much separates from the majority of religious people, but something he does paint as a thing that benefits from the rigid structure of authoritarian religious systems. It's very interesting in this story. One of the questions it asks is, what would a god do if a god was truly good? It talks about how maybe the flaws of religions at their core come from us as humans putting things on pedestals at all. And the deities we have created in our past are flawed because we are as well. I think it does a good job as well of implying that whether humans created gods, whether gods created humans, if a religion is doing a good job at keeping people kind and keeping society peaceful, does it really matter from a philosophical standpoint? I think to people with very anti-religious sentiments, it's probably a book that will make them realize that there are or there could be nice bits to religion and it could do a lot of good for people. Whereas to people who are already heavily religious, it might make them see that there are issues within religious systems. The weirdly heavy review for a small fantasy book, but Terry Pratchett does this. There is one trope that occurs again and again within fantasy, and I wonder if it comes from a demonization of religion by a lot of fantasy authors, or if it's a reflection of historical world events, the conquering of the world, the colonization of the world by the West, and speaks to how much fantasy draws from history. But you get this trope a lot, and it is how a monotheistic religion is the baddie religion, especially if it revolves around sun god worship, like an all-encompassing god. You get it a lot in fantasy stuff. Peaceful polytheistic societies stamped out by one bully big boy. I wonder why that's so reoccurring. Is this a good place to jump into Discworld? I would say this is a good place. You get a really good taste of what Terry Pratchett's sense of humor is like, the way his characters interact with each other. This also doesn't have any characters aside from Death, who pops up everywhere, shared with other books, so there's not a lot that's going to be lost through lack of context. I would say, however, that because this doesn't share a setting with most of Pratchett's other books, the vibe is quite different. Most take place in a comedy, dark, grubby city full of fantasy creatures and magicians called Ankh-Morpork. But this one, I think probably purposefully, takes place in an analog eastern deserty setting that harkens to the settings of the core stories in Abrahamic religions. I think his other settings are a lot more interesting. Sadly, I think this one doesn't really contribute to the overall world build of the disc. But because this is a standalone, it's probably less daunting, less of a commitment to jump into, test the waters, see if you like it. I don't know. I would suggest there are better places to jump in. Personally, I think the best place being Guards, the first in the Sam Vimes storyline, or maybe Mort, the first in the Death story series. I would say on a negative front, there are a couple of things in Terry Pratchett's stories which do jump out at me that I'm not sure how I feel about. The first is that despite it being a fantasy world, a fantasy setting, Terry Pratchett uses a lot of weird real life synonyms and descriptions, similes, like a train or like a nuclear bomb, when those things in this setting don't exist. And it makes it feel like it's a story being told to you aware that you do not exist within this universe. Like you're an observer watching a play. And I think for me, it reinforces that it's pretend and maybe sometimes makes me feel a little bit removed from the story. While this wasn't my favorite Terry Pratchett book so far, that place still going to Reaper Man. This is still a really well written one with some great messages, a lot to think about. And I highly recommend it, even if you haven't read any Discworld stuff before. So it's 4 stars from me, I think. So thanks for tuning in for that review. Don't forget to follow me on Goodreads and Twitter, which I'll link down below if you want to join our Interstellar Book Club. That'll be linked down below as well. That'll probably kick off again in the new year properly. And I'll see you soon for the next review. Bye!